I'm Cynthia Jackson.
Buenas tardes, soy Cynthia Jackson Hammond, presidenta del Consejo de Educación Superior Acreditación, que llamamos CHEA, de Washington, D.C. CHEA es la única organización sin ánimo de lucros que da reconocimiento para los que dan acreditación. Somos no gubernamentales y servimos más de 1.900 colegios y universidades, teniendo abogacía, reconocimiento de acreditaciones y ayuda para familias, estudiantes e instituciones. Van a escuchar más acerca de nuestro trabajo localmente, nacionalmente e internacionalmente en la presentación que vamos a dar. Un afiliado de CHEA es CIQG, CHEA International Quality Group, el Grupo Internacional de Calidad. Y los miembros de CHEA CIQG son los que van a presentar la presentación esta tarde. Voy a presentar nuestros prominentes y distinguidos Dr. Caroline Campbell, que se levante la mano. Ha trabajado en control de calidad en la educación superior a nivel nacional, europeo e internacional. Contribuido al Observatorio UE y OSD, los proyectos y publicaciones sobre la transferencia, la educación transfronteriza y la normativa. Caroline, en estos momentos, es miembro del Comité del Registro EQUA sobre control de calidad y es un miembro de Holt International Business School en su consejo de administración, y en 2002 se le dio el premio OB para servicios a la educación superior. Doctora Campbell, doctora profesora o catedrática, doctora Badrawi, la principal
Arab Network for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, and she is an Egyptian expert in quality assurance and accreditation in higher education and a professor emeritus of pediatrics at Cairo University. Professor Badrawi is a board member of the Advisory Council of the CHEA International Quality Group, the TNE Quality Board Advisory Board, and the Global Pediatrics Education Consortium. She disseminated the culture of quality assurance in higher education in Egypt and in the Arab region. Professor Badrawi is chairing the reform efforts of medical education in Egypt, a member of the Board of Trustees of the El Alamein International University. She was one of the main founders to establish and develop the National Quality Assurance Authority in Education in Egypt. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Dr. Jamil Sami is Dr. Jamil, there you are, is a global tertiary education expert, providing policy advice to governments, universities, and development agencies with experience working in more than 100 countries all over the world. Dr. Sami is Emeritus Professor of Higher Education Policy at Diego Portales University in Chile, and Research Fellow at Boston College Center for Higher Education. His latest book on tertiary education and the Sustainable Development Goals was published in August 2017. In 2020, he wrote a report on the impact of COVID on higher education through the equity lens for the Lumina Foundation. Dr. Sami. And now we have Dr. Michelle Claville. Michelle is CHEA's Vice President for Research and Policy Analysis. She also serves as liaison to the CHEA International Quality Group. Michelle has extensive experience in developing and advocating for DEI initiatives in higher ed. Not only has she worked as a professor of chemistry conducting scientific research, but she has ensured that said research engaged and prepared diverse students to engage in STEM initiatives at the highest level. Her work was funded by the United States National Science Foundation, where she subsequently worked as a program officer in the Directorate for Education and Human Resources, a unit dedicated to achieving excellence in U.S. science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education at all levels, in all settings, both formal and informal, to develop the diversity and well-prepared workforce for scientists. Her work as a professor and university administrator ensured the creation and the sustenance of quality programs to support quality institutions that were accredited by recognized accreditors throughout the United States. Michelle brings a wealth of experience in science, research, university administration, and DEI initiatives to CHEA and CIQG. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel for today. Over the last 3 years, the higher education communities across the globe have had to face head-on challenges associated with providing quality assurance to its many stakeholders. The pandemic reminded us that there are multiple areas of equity in higher education that impact accreditation organizations in providing fair and balanced attention to how learning occurs and how it is received and how it is measured. Undoubtedly, the health concerns of students, faculty, and staff, institutions, and accreditation organizations have had to shift and rethink standards. They have had to think about access and fairness in the context of students. But it is not just the pandemic that has influenced that thinking. The social, political context of the world has all of us really examining just what is equity, what is fairness. And as an organization, are we looking at equity through the lens of the recipients of the organization and not just the organization? Today's panelists will present to you some of the data gleaned from quality assurance organizations from all over the globe. The findings will bring to us the fact that there is still much to be done to ensure that the constructs of diversity, equity, and inclusion are implemented in a way that provides the best outcomes for student learners and the best student outcomes, period. The focus of the presentation is addressing equity with international accrediting organizations. Dr. Claville will begin the discussion. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Well, I don't know what the protocol here, but hola, ¿cómo está usted? Bueno. Okay, good day. As you've heard, I am Michelle Claville, and I want to start off by telling you a little bit more about CHEA, or as Cynthia has said, and I want to thank you for that kind introduction, the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. CHEA is an association of degree-granting colleges and universities, and we are located in the United States of America. It was established in 1996 due to a referendum of of college university presidents in the United States that wanted an independent, non-governmental body to oversee accreditation in the United States. The purpose of CHEA, we recognize, one of the things that we do is that we recognize institutional and programmatic accrediting organizations. CHEA is a major national voice, an advocate for higher education accreditation and quality assurance, and we support and work to advance the role of accreditation in maintaining core academic values of higher education. And of course, we have commitments to institutional autonomy, academic freedom, and institutional mission. We serve as a national and international authority on this topic of accreditation and quality assurance, and an unsurpassed information resource. Cynthia has already alluded to some of the information in this slide. We serve higher education by recognition of accrediting bodies to ensure institutions and program quality. We coordinate research, discussions, and processes to improve accreditation. We serve as a national advocate for voluntary self-regulation through accreditation, collection and dissemination of information about accreditation, and we mediate concerns that may come as a result of accreditation matters, fostering communication between our accreditors and our higher education institutions. And then, of course, we're committed to preserving the mission, quality, and diversity of colleges and universities. And I'll pass it on.
So about the CHEA International Quality Group, it's an international component of the CHEA. It's established in September 2012, and I was honored to be in their advisory board since its inception. We are committed to enhancing global quality assurance efforts in higher education by studying and advancing understanding of international quality assurance, assisting institutions and accreditation quality assurance organizations all over the world in their expanding international programs, promoting the development of policies that further enhances capacity for academic quality in international higher education. We have formulated the 7 international principles where there is a guiding principle that serve a framework for international deliberation about quality assurance in higher education. And we have signed 70 memorandum of affiliation to date. It's long. Most of the countries are. We have 91 active members as part of the CHEA International Quality Group. Our regular activities include presentations, webinar, discussion of its member, participation at the CHEA annual conference, think tank of broad discussion on international trends, research study regarding international quality assurance aspect or topics, collaboration and presentation with international colleagues all over the world. And I think that we are really committed to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. And this is part of the CHEA International Quality Group.
So I want to tell you a little bit more about our work, what led us to this study, and a little bit about the characteristics of CHEA so that you understand our investment and our commitment to this particular topic. Very recently, as you know, the world has been focused on matters that pertain to equity. It is no secret, it's in the news, not just in the United States, but internationally, that there are matters that we must address in order to ensure that we continue the work that UNESCO has so gallantly led with regard to advancing quality education across the world. CHEA decided to put out a statement by way of our president, and so I elected to give you an excerpt of that statement, which you see here. And so I'll read it, And I will also refer to another aspect that I did not put, but I do think is relevant for this particular conversation. CHEA's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness guides its mission and its support for equitable treatment for institutions of higher education, families, and students. CHEA's commitment to higher education, families, students, and other communities is grounded in the assurance of academic quality. We believe that the rich values of diversity, equity, and inclusion are inextricably linked to quality assurance in higher education. Additionally, CHEA affirms that diversity, equity, and inclusion contribute to student success, contributes to a better, healthier, and more enlightened progressive society. And so it is within this context that all things CHEA led to this particular study that was initiated and I would say managed by our CIQG arm. This statement that you see, and I can't point, I'm sorry, it is to my right, is one that I found on a blog. And there was a conversation that was led by the authors of this blog about why is it important for us to have this conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion internationally. And so you'll see from that quote, it says, as diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes a part of the everyday conversation at work, we noticed a thread of skepticism from international colleagues about the relevance of diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond the US borders. And so as you continue to read, it says, unfortunately, structural inequality and bias are global phenomena. And so it leads to the next statement that I have posed to you. Over the past decade, more higher education agencies across the globe have begun to pay attention to this matter and to ensure that we address it while making sure that we understand its importance and relevance to quality and then the implications with regard to national policies and international policies. And so let me introduce you to the purpose of our study. For short, I'll just say CHEA, if you don't mind. CHEA and CIQG, we wanted to learn if and how accrediting organizations for higher education institutions across the globe addressed the concept of equity. So we wanted to focus on the equity piece and its application to quality assurance in higher education. And so collectively, we came up with this definition of equity. It is for our study, and the information that you will hear from this point, it is focused on this definition, and I want to make that emphasis. This is the definition that we focused our study on, and our definition states, the application of fairness in policies and practices associated with inclusion from underrepresented student populations and their academic success. To tell you a little bit about our methodology, we developed survey questions with our ad hoc research team. The member of the team are here, and we have an advisory council. So everyone here is on that advisory council of CIQG, but just these few and two more, I believe, were a part of that research team. Then, of course, we had a great deal of discussion. We reviewed it for validity of purpose. We administered our survey through this agent called Typeform. And we chose that because, of course, you can get immediate feedback, which was consolidated on our behalf, and then we could extrapolate the raw data, and you'll see the results of that as Jamil continues with our dissection of the study. It was administered electronically with the help of some of our colleagues from INCWAHE, from members of our council. We wanted to make sure that we heard voices from quality assurance agencies across the world representing as many regions as we could. And then I've already told you that it was captured by Typeform. And then one of the things that I want to point out, though you see this number that we'll present shortly, there were some surveys that were incomplete, or it was obvious that you could not use it to determine any trends. And so, of course, those were included. I'll now turn it over to Jamil.
Thank you, Michelle. Before I go through the survey question, I just want to emphasize again something that Michelle just mentioned about the recent evolution. Traditionally, as you know, in many countries in the world, there was this tension, sometimes dichotomy, between quality and inclusion, and the assumption by many higher education and university leaders that to reach academic excellence, you needed to be very selective. The more selective you are, the better students you get. And luckily, over the years, this assumption has been challenged, and there are universities that have shown the way and shown that you did not necessarily abandon this hope of being more diverse, inclusive, offer equitable opportunities at the risk of sacrificing quality. So we ask the following questions in our survey. First, yes or no question: does your quality assurance agency take into consideration this DEI agenda that Cynthia presented at the beginning? And then the second question, we try to identify the equity focus, what we call the equity focus groups. Which groups of traditionally underserved students do you take into consideration? For example, and we gave a list of examples from which, just to explain what we were after, but this was left open to the agencies to tell us how they handled it. But we mentioned, of course, low-income students, first-generation students, female students, students with disabilities, or members of various ethnic groups. And then we asked them to tell us if they include DEI in their criteria or procedures. Why did that come about? Was it a national decision, or was it their own decision? We wanted to understand the rationale behind their inclusion of DEI criteria. And then we also ask a question about the type of delivery that they were taking into consideration. Again, before the pandemic, many quality assurance agencies worked only or primarily on traditional campus, on-campus, face-to-face delivery modes. And then you had specialized agencies or a special department within a traditional agency looking at online or distance education. But after the pandemic, things have become much blurrier, and we see hybrid education. So we wanted to find out also what the agencies were doing. And lastly, we had an open question to encourage them to give us more information. So the participants at the end of the day we had responses, valid responses from 55 QA agencies coming from 36 countries, and you can see the distribution on the table: 2 from East Asia, 5 from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, 3 from Latin America, 9 from the Middle East and North Africa. We can see the influence of Nadia pushing them. 2 from North America, 4 from Sub-Saharan Africa, and 11 from Western Europe. Unfortunately, we didn't get any response from South Asia. In terms of quantitative results, we found that QA agencies in 31 countries out of the 34 surveyed did, in one way or the other, include this dimension. And you can see here the results. I don't need to go to in detail, but you can see that the majority, in fact, are now including that, which is really an encouraging trend. And concretely, if you want to know which countries, like agencies from which countries that do include DEI, for East Asia, we have Japan and the Philippines. In Latin America, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico. In the Middle East and North Africa, Egypt, Jordan, Oman, Bahrain, the UAE, Israel, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Morocco. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Mauritania, Senegal, and South Africa. And finally, in Western Europe, Austria, Belgium, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Malta, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey. Now, it doesn't mean that there are not more countries, including that they just did not respond necessarily to our survey. Now, in terms of qualitative, perhaps last point I wanted to make, or was it you were supposed to make that? So I hand over to Nadia.
Okay, actually, part of the results that a student with disability is the most frequently focus group that most of the countries have a special application for student with disability. The second is low income and rural student, and this has come more from Africa, ECA, LAC, and Western Europe. Then comes the female student, and amazing that the Africa and MENA region, the most organizations, they said that they have included the female student in their equity and in their standard, actually. Then come the ethnic minority and the refugees. Recently, the refugees are everywhere in Western Europe. Another thing that the quality response, there was no clear pattern actually to explain why quality assurance agencies are starting to introduce DEI dimension in their standard and criteria. Notably, actually, exception Africa and Western Europe, national mandates through policies and or legislation, Europe Quality Assurance Guideline, and they all use the SGD agenda. Most of Europeans use the SD agenda. When in place, DEI criteria apply to all delivery modality, face-to-face, online, hybrid, micro-credential. They are all say that they are using it. Me? Okay. Another area that several agencies look at the proportion between female in university leadership position as the main criteria for introducing the equity. Several agencies all over the world, they are doing that. A few agencies looks at added value to measure the learning experience of students from equity target groups. And actually, the focus is still on high school graduate and hardly anything about life learning. Most of the quality assurance did not specify the life learning in this. And lastly, no indication that quality assurance agency look at the impact of curriculum content. They said, yes, we are doing that, but they don't go further and look for the impact in their curriculum about the DEI. And this is also something that we may have to work on it.
It's already requested right here.
Hello, everyone. Right, okay, well, I've not got any statistics to give you, facts and figures, but rather we were looking at some of the inferences that could be drawn from the responses that we had. And I think I just sort of preface this by saying that the quality assurance agencies in the survey are not homogeneous. They're not homogeneous around the world in terms of the size of the agency, their mandate, or their focus. So it's not surprising that there was diversity in their responses. But also, as everyone knows here, demographics and economic and social agendas and policies all have an impact on higher education. So again, it's perhaps not surprising that there was diversity in responses from contributing agencies around what the priorities of their governments were. But perhaps there's another issue that has been sort of alluded to and that we will expand on later, and that is actually how far agencies themselves may be engaged in higher education policy discussions, or actually aware of wider agendas, or indeed have the power to determine their operations and their standards. We did note that where countries had national legislation, particularly around discrimination, there seemed to be...
Your mic is not working, apparently.
It's not working? Oh, sorry.
Her mic.
I thought I had a loud enough voice for people to hear at the back anyway.
But the interpreters.
It's
All
for
right, okay. Now I've got to do a kind of karaoke bit here. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, there's a sort of this idea that is there explicit attention to issues around discrimination and equity? If it's in national legislation, there seemed, as I said, to be some kind of assumption that, oh, well, higher education institutions were doing it anyway, and it wasn't the business of quality assurance agencies. But I would ask the question, who then has the responsibility in such circumstances to ensure that there is non-discrimination in higher education? While it's reassuring that the agencies were taking account of equity and fairness in terms of applying their own processes and to their own operations, again, the responses are perhaps a further indication of a limited view of involvement of quality agencies in wider DEI issues. Could you do the next slide? Thanks. Thank you. An observation, of course, you know, I mean, I am from the UK and that is in Europe, but all the European agencies, barring one, who reported, are actually from countries that participate in the European higher education area. I mean, some people in the room may be more familiar to it as being referred to as the Bologna process. And since 2007, the social dimension in higher education, including equity, diversity and inclusion, and service or engagement with community, has been an action theme in the process. And it has moved up the agenda with making systems more inclusive being seen as an essential aim in the European higher education area, particularly as populations become more and more diversified, due, yes, to immigration and including refugees, but also to demographic changes, aging populations in some countries, and also the pace of technological change, which actually is pushing the lifelong learning agenda. In 2020, principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education in the European higher education area were adopted. There are actually 10 principles, but there isn't one that's specifically focused on quality assurance. So, again, I think that maybe shows that somehow it misses out in those sorts of debates. However, there is inclusion of quality assurance in the second guideline under Principle 7. I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with Principle 7. So I might just rehearse it for you, but Principle 7 states that public authorities should help higher education institutions to strengthen their capacity to respond to the need of a more diverse student and staff body and create inclusive learning environments and inclusive cultures. And the first guideline under this principle focuses on training for academic and administrative staff. And that actually is a very important issue in the quality debate, to make sure that academic and administrative staff are supported to carry forward changes and to implement new policies. The second guideline focuses on the role of external quality assurance, saying wherever possible, external quality assurance systems should address how the social dimension, diversity, accessibility, equity and inclusion are reflected in the institutional missions of higher education institutions while respecting the principle of autonomy. Work on this action is continuing, both to identify the current level of attention being given to equity and inclusion in higher education in Europe, and to report on the implementation of the principles. And I think that this is something that is also relates to national laws. It's one thing to have a law, but it's something else to make sure that it's implemented and to make sure it's implemented fairly. In March 2022, so that's really quite recently, Eurydice published a report towards equity and inclusion in higher education in Europe 2022, and it was analysing how aligned European higher education systems are to the 10 principles. It's a very useful report to look at, but in it they try to develop indicators to show how countries and systems were actually addressing the principles and the guidelines. And there is one, or there are indicators around quality assurance. We should be relieved to hear that, those of us from that domain, that top-level authorities should instruct quality assurance agencies to examine the mission of higher education institutions or their study programs, and that they should issue guidelines to quality assurance agencies to consider whether the social dimension is addressed in the mission of higher education institutions and or in their study programs. Could you do the next study clip? All of this has led us to ponder on some potential suggestions for further thought. First of all, that quality assurance agencies maybe to get out of their box a little bit more, to engage with other relevant stakeholders, including the higher education institutions, to formulate a clear definition of what DEI actually means for quality assurance, both internally and externally. And this would include the need to define target equity groups. But those have to be relevant to specific country contexts because they are different from one place to another. National authorities could involve quality assurance agencies in helping to think about the role of those agencies in promoting and supporting diversity and inclusion. We're sort of trying to enhance, if you like, the role of quality assurance, or at least the visibility of it. But then perhaps if we think about other debates that are current in higher education around student-centered learning and around the student experience, that's really where quality assurance agencies can look at issues around equity, diversity and inclusion, making sure that all students are getting a good experience, making sure that pedagogical strengths are improved in institutions, because that was one word that was not mentioned in any of the responses that we got to the survey. And finally, you'd expect researchers to say this, but perhaps more research is actually needed to determine how DEI is delivered and how related policies actually impact student and graduate success, an outcomes focus rather than simply an input focus.
Thank you. I don't think I need the mic. I think I'm okay. So, so we have the definition here that we used as a reminder of what the survey contextual thoughts were, and the responses responded to this definition. But based on what we have talked about, not only in the preparation of the survey and looking at the responses, I often wonder, would we be having this conversation at all about the international inclusion of DEI if it were not for the pandemic? The pandemic certainly did force us to look differently at the way higher education and quality assurance have been manifested throughout the world. I think online delivery has certainly put a spotlight on the haves and the have-nots. And the second question is, who is entitled to a quality higher education experience, and have we as an international higher education quality assurance group provided an opportunity for everyone to have access? That is embedded in what we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I have a couple of questions I want to ask the panelists, but before I do that, I want to recognize someone in the audience who has been a part of CHEA and CIQG almost, I want to say, for the lifetime of CIQG and CHEA, and that's Dr. Judith Eaton. Would you please? Thank you. Judith was the founding president for CHEA and CIQG, and we're so happy that she's still hanging in there with us and making sure that we carry the torch appropriately. So thank you for being here. I also would like to know who in the audience represents accrediting organizations. Would you hold your hand if you, okay, we have accrediting organizations. And who in the audience might represent membership in CHEA CIQG? Do we have any? Okay, very good. And institutions? Very good. So, because we have such a plethora of academicians and experts, I'm hoping that you have questions as well or comments to share at the end of this discussion. But let's begin with the first question here. In the understanding of DEI responses from the survey, do you think there is a need to try to codify the term equity in a way that accrediting organizations might address the construct in a more systematized manner? Should there be one general definition across the globe so that there's a systematic way of addressing it? Don't all speak at one time. What are your thoughts? And really, is it possible?
Yeah, actually. But in my personal understanding, you can't put a definition that all the world can agree on it. But we can put a bigger, broad something that people can, in different quality assurance agency, can say, I can be here, I can be here, I can be here. But at the end, after this survey, after reading the survey, I believe that we should do more awareness, because when we analyzing the survey, we could feel that it's so different between regions, and the understanding is so different between regions. I mean, there should be more discussion, more working about the definition, how to implement it, how to implement it actually, as we see in the quality assurance agency at the institution level, and little bit approaching that people can understand each other. This is my...
Jamil?
Yeah, if I may pick on this issue, I think the first place to start is about awareness. At the national level and at the institutional level. And there are countries that just don't pay much attention to the equity agenda, or sometimes even for philosophical reasons. So if you take France and Germany, for example, I don't know if we have anybody from these two countries, but it is prohibited by the Constitution to look at people and ask questions about different ethnic origins, for example, or different dimensions, and this is seen as a democratic way of giving the same rights to people. But in reality, there is discrimination in these countries. And so it is important, if you don't have, look at the numbers. I'm going to share an anecdote that I experienced many years ago, a few years ago. I was on an advisory council of a very famous German university, whose name I'm not going to mention. And we would meet once a year, and they would report on their progress on various things. And that year, they were really proud because they said, we've made so much progress to include more female students in engineering, all the STEM the programs where traditionally they would not be keen to study or they would not feel welcome to study. So we congratulated them on this achievement. And knowing that in that particular city, about 20% of the population are migrant worker, families of migrant workers, most of them of Turkish origins, I, a little bit mischievously, asked them, and how much progress have you made in terms of including students of Turkish origin? And there was a very long and almost embarrassed silence, and they said, oops, we don't have them on our radar screen. And if you don't have a particular group on your radar screen, you will not have statistics about them. So this whole issue of awareness about who are the groups in your society who are not on the map, who are not served by higher education and that need. And also, I think, and I'll stop there, it's very important to think in terms of what we call in our jargon intersectionality, is that it's not one characteristic or the other. You could be a woman from a group of, you could be a low-income woman, and you will find out that low-income women will be more discriminated against, or they have less opportunities than men from low-income families. So this issue of awareness, I think, is very important, and CHEA agencies can play a very important role.
And yes. Oh, absolutely.
Thank you. I am very curious to ask, because you just mentioned the importance of sorry. Excuse me, I will repeat my question. So I'm very curious, because you just mentioned how important statistics are to make clear and to make aware of these problems that there are in curricula in higher education institutions. But you also mentioned that in some countries, for example, Germany, I know in the Netherlands that's the case, I'm from the Netherlands myself, that we have the issue that on national level there is no distinction made between, for example, ethnic minorities or between these students who maybe need this distinction to have data on them. But you just mentioned that, so we cannot make a distinction, but we do need data. So I'm actually very curious how you as an organization would then deal with such a kind of issue in countries that it's actually very hard to acquire data, but we also know that it is very important to address the problem. So I'm very curious, how would you as an organization deal with that and try that those local organizations enforce that?
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is Umayma Al-Hobzouri, and I'm from the Netherlands. I'm studying now in Barcelona, and I did an internship within UNESCO Higher Education Department.
Yes.
I want to thank you for that question, and I really appreciate the comments of my colleagues already. One of the things that I guess obviously from my title, I'm a big proponent of is getting as much information as we can from wherever we're allowed to get that information. So there are places that we are allowed to ask the types of questions that we cannot ask in, for example, France or from your nation. And if we are to constantly bombard the international space with this kind of data as much of a global effort as possible through our organizations and organizations that are like ours, then this genre of publication, in my personal opinion, provides an avenue for putting pressure, if you will, on those who would not like to report those kinds of information. And I would dare say there are some that would like to report, for example, percentage, data in terms of percentage. But if I say, oh, 25% of my institution has, for example, my department is female or a woman. But if you have 4 and there is 1 woman, what have you done across your institution or your organization or the like? And so, yes, it's the way, it's not just collecting the numbers, but the way that it's presented and then the quantity. So that is one thing that I would be a big proponent for.
I want to add something that Jamil said that really highlights some of the things that we did with CHEA. He said, start with awareness.
Yes.
Start with the conversation and the identification of your values and what you truly believe in, and harness a group that might have like values regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because you cannot implement if you do not value DEI. So whatever your definitions might be for those constructs, you have to begin with what we call reflective practice. What does it mean? How is it implemented? Is there a value attached to that meaning? Whether or not it's a small organization, a small institution, large or whatever, start the awareness conversations. We often talk about diversity, equity, inclusion as if it's one construct. It's 3 different constructs that sometimes intermingle. Diversity really represents who is in the room. Who is in the room? Equity is the fairness of application. Now this is a United States interpretation. It's no one else. But for us in the States, it's who is, what levels of policies and procedures are fairly being implemented for those people or those various groups that's in the room that represents diverse population. Inclusion means not only just who's in the room, but who's making the decisions. Who has an opportunity to have voice? So sometimes you can separate those constructs. Sometimes they need to work in tandem. So there's a lot of, there's not one way to get to a DEI platform, variety of ways. And certainly those varieties began with what Jamil spoke about and what we call reflective practices, being aware that there is a concern, being aware that there's an opportunity to address those concerns. Nadia mentioned that you mentioned that there was no one definition for equity, right? So we talk about it in terms of fairness. What else should be considered in that term? Not necessarily one definition, but what else should be considered when talking about equity?
Can we ask the audience this
absolutely.
question? I mean, can we ask the audience this question? Because we would like to have more input about this. Yeah. Tariq.
Sorry, for the translation, we need you to speak with the mic,
Jamil.
please.
Okay. Tariq Al-Sindi, Chief Executive, Education and Training Quality Authority. I'll talk about my perspective when I review any quality assurance agency or when I review any education, quality assurance or university. We always ask and we always give sometimes one recommendation when we see any practice. We always ask them to develop and implement the effectiveness and mechanism to measure this practice, whether in our case equity, we need to see how effective they are in measuring the effectiveness of this practice within the institution. Because I can have a policy, a lovely policy, but how effective this policy being developed? And then we triangulate. We ask faculty, we ask students, stakeholders to measure the success and how effective this practice, this policy, or this procedure. This is how we look at these different dimensions.
So there should always basically, and I think we all concur, some level of evaluation as to whether or not the policies and the practices are effective to what the intended outcome should be. Absolutely.
Exactly. And we ask them to close the loop. But with equity, it is different how they, as Jamil mentioned, how they look at it. Sometimes institutions want the bright side of their reputation. So they will try to avoid implementing few policies. And sometimes you will see the opposite. They need a clear sheet. They need all these policies and procedures to be developed and implemented, and they need just to close the loop. They need also to measure them in a cyclical time, every 5 years. And they need also, and some of them, they benchmark their policies with other institutions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that was very well said, and thank you so very much for sharing that, because it's through that evaluation process that you can really reflect on what needs to change, what needs to continue. So that's that model of continuous improvement. And too often, I think when we think about DEI, we think it's something that you write and that's it, and not a necessary recurring reflection of, did it work?
It's not a binary yes or no.
Yes, yes. Yes, here. We have several people here.
Hello, my name is Renato Pedrosa. I'm from Brazil. And I was surprised that Brazil was not included in your survey.
We asked.
Because I don't know what happened, but I can imagine. But I think that, you see, you mentioned the three aspects, but the three aspects are already there, because you're talking fairness, then you talk about inclusion, and then you talk who's in the room because it's underrepresented. So that definition, at least, is including all your three concepts, let's say. And I think the most complicated one is fairness. Because if you talk up to most university administrators 20 years ago in Brazil, they would say our system is fair. Because you have an entrance exam, which is, there's no foul play, there's no problem, and it's meritocratic, so if you do well, you come in. There's the rich people are not supposedly coming in through other ways, and it's fair. And today, if you ask the same people if they think it was fair, they say it was not fair. And this 20 years difference is lots of political struggle in various levels. And I think that's one issue. You have to fight at every level, from the department to the university councils, to the state legislation, to the national legislation. There's no way one institution can do a little, can do if you get convinced and you convince enough people. But for something to really have an impact on society, it has to have all these levels. And usually a national mandate helps a lot. And in Brazil, we have a national mandate for the inclusion of people originally coming from Africa, the slaves and their descendants. And this was very tough to go through, because there was this issue of, but if we introduce in a law the difference in people because of their color or because of their ethnic origin, then we are introducing racism in Brazil. And then, but a lot of people say, but we have racism in Brazil. It's not in the law, but it's in society. So you need the law at least to. So this is very complicated. And there were a lot of very smart people in sociology, anthropology, fighting against it, and not from a conservative point of view, but because they thought that that would introduce some sort of a formal racist element in Brazilian law. But it was a de facto situation. And I think there was no other way fighting the de facto situation with a law that would establish that and specify what was what. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, a very important point. Thank you.
May I make one, ma'am? Thank you so much for your comments. I'm going to get out of the box a little bit, and I promise to honor your protocols. So if I were to come here, and I'll ask my AV people to help me, if I were to give my presentation from here, I can look down and see the monitor. Yes? And so can our moderator. She can see the monitor. If I were to ask my colleague Carolyn, would you stand, please? I'm not, I just want to make a point. For her to see it, we tried this earlier, she has to come here. Now, let's say there was this law that said all of us should stand behind the podium to speak to you. I can see it. Cynthia can see it. Carolyn, who has a wealth of knowledge and expertise, how is she to see it and give you the presentation and share all the intellectual aptitude that is Carolyn? Except you provide a fair way for her to stand and give her presentation, hence the figure behind the definition, and I'll stop there.
So there is a difference between equality and equity.
Yeah.
Big difference. You know, everyone has an equal opportunity to do something, but is it a fair opportunity to everyone who has a diversity of height and any other characteristics associated with who they are as an individual human being? I saw a hand back here, yes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question slightly aside from the main discussion here, but related to it. My name, by the way, is Michael Benedict. I'm in Doha, Qatar right now, although I've spent most of my career in the United States. For those of us who have done work in DEI and really trying to promote equity across our institutions, one of the biggest struggles that at least I have always had is fighting the mythology. The mythology is, well, this group is never going to get to that level because of reason A, you know, and whatever reason A is. And it is those mythologies that are often stopping programs from going forward. As an example that I really like, some years ago I was talking to department head of our math department who said, well, there are just not enough women who get their PhDs in mathematics. At which point I pointed out that in Eastern Europe, the majority of faculty were women in mathematics, and that stopped the discussion and turned it. So what I'm asking, I guess, is that your organization is in a position to perhaps provide very interesting, robust benchmarks that the rest of us can use in our work to fight these mythologies, because you have access to sort of data across the world that none of us have an ability to get.
Exactly.
And so I want to throw that at you to see whether it might be something to consider.
And it's stuck. When you threw it, we caught it.
Good idea.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cynthia, can I?
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. And when we were talking about the dynamics between national legislation and institutions, QA agencies are in the middle. They play a very important, and because not in every country, but in most countries, they have an independent status. They can work in a compulsory way almost, or pushy way by putting the standards, including DEI and the standards. But another more subtle and I think more effective way is to do what we're trying to do today, and what happens at the annual CHEA conference is to disseminate good practices. Yes. And there are so many, and you're right, there are, just to give you two examples, In the US, the average proportion of women in engineering education throughout the country is 25%. And then there is this one very innovative institution, I'm a big fan of them, called Olin College of Engineering. It's a young 15-year-old institution, and their curriculum, their approach, their pedagogy is totally different. And they have 50% of female students. And it's not because they had affirmative action or special scholarships, it's just that the education experience that they're offering, it's not boring math for young girls, it's just a different experience. Another experience, my friend here, Professor Pedrosa from Brazil, who is very modest, so he didn't want to elaborate, but on Friday he will have a session where he said, but just to summarize, his university, and he was the lead person in doing that, applied a little bit what has happened in Texas, the principle of picking the best student in all high schools in the province, if I'm not wrong, Renato, and there was an affirmative action. They could enter with less percentage on the very competitive entrance examination, and then they got support, academic support and psychological and financial as needed, and they performed as well as the other students. And as a result, it became, several years later, there was a law in Brazil. So I think by disseminating good practices that have been assessed, evaluated, to see how it works, and there was very rigorous evaluation in Unicamp's case, quality assurance agencies and accreditors can really do
effort. Because once you uncover policies, procedures, practices, social cultural influences that impact the student success of college students, it's almost putting the cart behind the horse. And so the practice, the understanding of it as a national and international construct should influence the way the politicians or the political, governmental, non-governmental agencies work together to ensure that DEI is integrated very early, and the values and understanding of that simply progress as students go from elementary to college level. So there is much to be done in this field, and it does not start with higher ed. Sometimes it ends there, but that's not where it should start. And but I think higher education and quality assurances has a greater impact and can influence what happens in lower grades. So the conversation must be continuous.
There's a gentleman.
Yes, I saw a hand back, yes.
Thank you very much. First, thanks everyone for a really, really stimulating conversation. I mean, my mind's just bubbling up with points. My name's Juan Marciai. I'm a manager of review and assessment with the Indigenous Advanced Education and Skills Council in the province of Ontario in Canada. And our organization is an independent, apolitical, non-governmental quality assurance body for Indigenous institutes. They're Indigenous-controlled, Indigenous-run higher education organizations. And my question is to the question of, in a sense, open up the box of inclusion, right, and looking in. I wanted to ask, it's partly comment, partly question, to join some of the other points made. Looking at it from a sort of, in a sense, a decolonial standpoint, and where inclusion or equity, as was mentioned, I mean, diversity, it's just the numbers, right, of people in the room. But even the question of voice, when we get to inclusion, more than voice, right? I'm looking at it from the perspective of basically epistemic justice, right, from a decolonial standpoint, where EDI is looking, actually, it cuts deeper, right? It's looking at the recognition and true inclusion of different worldviews, different ways of knowing, different ways of being, of thinking, of learning, of teaching. And what that actually does, I mean, I'm just also thinking of the keynotes earlier today about those spaces for innovation and the opportunities to really include in the deepest of ways, in ways that really transform higher education, rather than just, in a sense, making those coming in to conform to what is there,
Yes.
right? So the numbers may be there, the proportions may be there, but the depth of that inclusion still remains. There are questions, and this is something also in our work that we struggle. I mean, how do we manage and generate and use the data, right, from all of that? But I think there are many ways, many creative ways around curriculum, around pedagogy, around all the support. I'm also from Brazil, so the questions of having the support for those students coming in, from our perspective, is understanding the student as a whole person, right? From and all the wraparound services that need to be in place to support and promote the well-being of that learner throughout, and in a way that sees their education as lifelong. And lifelong it looks both ways, right? I mean, lifelong, to your comment about K-16, lifelong operates at the admission end because it's recognizing previous learning that may not have happened in classrooms. But lifelong is also forward learning, right, on the recognition of those credentials that may come from that education. And it's all these elements. I'm just throwing out some elements around the deepening of that understanding of EDI just from some of the experiences that we've had in our work. So thank you again for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
May I tag along?
Yes. Carolyn?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just thank you very much for that comment. I mean, I think that, I mean, one of the things that you were articulating is one of the main characteristics of student-centered learning, which is actually continuous monitoring of student needs. It's sort of, it's not just enough to get people there. It's actually the whole, as you said, the whole round, not only the pedagogy, but all the other kind of support that students need in terms, yeah, of housing, of food, of whatever. Knowing your students is very important now. I think, you know, traditional universities in the past just made assumptions about students. You know, yeah, they'd all get high grades. Yeah, they'd all been to good high schools. You know, we can just sort of dish up the same stuff year after year. She says, having gone to a classic university herself many years ago. But, you know, things are different now. And that's why I think that it is useful if we kind of like, not overemphasize. I mean, I guess that, you know, from an institution myself now, that people are worried about having inspectors in the back of the classroom again, you know. But yes, having this focus on pedagogy and on supporting academic and administrative staff to understand that, you know, we're living in a different world. There are actually different expectations of students in terms of their experience. And being able, the institution being able to demonstrate, not simply to the students, but to the outside world, that they are delivering on what they've promised.
I'd like to also agree, I agree with everything Carolyn said, and your comment about the depth of this conversation. For the traditional approach to this topic in higher ed is, how do we, and I'm going to generalize this, fix the student, right? And so we have to do this for the student and do that for the student, and I think it's brilliant. However, in order to truly be student-centered, one must also understand, and my colleague just said it, the constraints and the background of our students. Why am I saying this? I taught one of the most favorite subjects forever, organic chemistry. Smile. Yes. And so I knew from interacting with my students that there was brilliance in them, but their performance was not necessarily at the level that it should have been until I engaged them personally and started finding out that students sometimes did not have electricity in the United States. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they had to take their funds to support family back home, right? And then I could go on and on about the different situations that caused brilliant students to underperform. So until I fixed my expectations and understood that not everybody went home to internet service, and this pandemic pulled the covers back, because now we started seeing that sometimes faculty did not even have the resources to engage students at the level that we expected to say all that is higher ed. So if I start understanding those, those fundamental constructs, and then take it a step further to understand cultural norms. In some places, for example, I went to a talk and we had a presenter who was representing the Hispanic culture, and I say Hispanic, Latino, and certain of those cultures where women were not necessarily expected to engage in education in the United States as other women would, let's say that. And so when you are dealing with these cultural differences and still in the classroom or at the institution expecting more engagement and higher performance, we sit from our perspective and say they cannot learn, they cannot engage. And so it doesn't have to be women. It can be another demographic. There has to be a change, that's my bottom line, in not just addressing the student, but addressing the way we view the student, engage with the student, understand the student, so that we can accomplish the goal that is a global goal, higher ed for all. Quality.
Just pick up one point, maybe two examples relating to what you said about your experience in Ontario, which I really, which really fits into or resonates with me. Recently, I was invited by the government of Panama to help them think about, they have this project of opening a university for the indigenous people in Panama for the first time, which sounds like a nice idea, but in our first conversation, I stopped them. I said, stop there right now. The concept should not be that you, the white Panamanians, descendants of the Spanish colony, will open for the indigenous, but you need to work with the indigenous community to see what education and needs they have, and how you could support them in establishing this kind of institutions. What the point you were making about recognizing different ways of doing things and the knowledge of these communities. I think that's a very important point. The other example resonates with me. At the annual CHEA conference this year, I don't know if it was Cynthia or Michelle who had the brilliant idea to invite as keynote speaker the president of Gallaudet University. Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if you know this university.
She was here in the morning.
You invited her.
I confess that I invited her, and she's giving a keynote tomorrow afternoon. I really encourage you to attend.
You have to.
So Gallaudet University is the only university in the world that I'm aware of that is for the deaf community and managed by the deaf community. And Roberta Cordano, who will be, is the first both female and deaf president of that institution, because before there were male and hearing presidents. And one thing that stuck with me when she made her presentation in January was, in many countries, they don't care about their deaf community or people with disabilities. At least in the US, there are laws that oblige institutions to provide, for example, in the case of deaf people, interpretation, sign language interpretation. The government will pay, or there are subsidies to pay for that. And so that's very well, so that they can study. But she was explaining to us, that's only half of the college experience. How about social activities, cultural activities, sports? I was not entitled to someone, so I was in my corner because the other speaking and hearing students would have their activities and I would be left alone because they would not speak, use sign language.
Yeah.
So there are so many dimensions that need to be taken into consideration. What Carol was saying about a student-centered approach to really identify their needs, listen to them to express what are their needs and how we can shape the experience to support them.
Yes, yes. And we are delighted that she's here.
Yeah.
And you should, if you
should
can,
attend her. Yeah.
please
It's
attend
very
the session.
impressive. Yeah.
So we are coming very close to the end, but I want to ask you something. And I would love to hear your response. Should diversity, equity, and inclusion be viewed in your country as a supporter for social justice? Or is DEI perceived as a disruptor to the way things are done within your country? Is there a positive influence for DEI, or is it a negative disruptor? How is it perceived?
Difficult question.
Is that too much to ask in a public forum?
Mona,
Boris Johnson.
she wants to.
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you all for this
We need the mic.
session.
Microphone, please.
Right? Aquí adelante, por favor.
Hello, I'm Mona Abdelal from Egypt, Ain Shams University. I'm the Executive Director of Education Strategy Administration at the university. First of all, I want to thank you for your fruitful presentations and discussions. For equity, in my country, there are many efforts to achieve this goal, but sometimes the application to achieve equity, in my point of view, is not that good. When people try to make equity, they just say, well, I will take 50%, for example, males and 50% females, without putting a selection criteria. I think this is not equity. This is a biased equity toward one of the two genders. But I think when I try to do equity in its right form, it's properly putting a high selective criteria, not depending at all on any discrimination point, and then select according to this. Whether maybe when I put this selection criteria, I got all the selected people males, or all of them females, but putting a certain percentage, I think it's not fair and not achieve the fairness. Maybe it's not objective enough. That's my concern usually on the trials to achieve equity. I think it's not the right way to achieve equity, actually.
Okay, thank you. Any other responses?
Well, about your question, I think in a country, any country will have people that will see it one way, and the other people see it the other way around. So.
And which way do you want to? No, I'm just joking.
Well, no, it's easy to answer that, but I think that I like to mention one thing is related to what you're saying is that a big part of the issue is teaching, developing in teachers the awareness. And universities, in most places, educate teachers. And sometimes the people at the universities are not trained to deal with these issues.
Absolutely.
And they train new teachers, which won't be. So it's to break this cycle, I think, is related to what you're saying, but it's not so easy. So you have to go slowly and introduce in some areas this kind of, you mentioned chemistry. I've been a math college educator for 40 years, and it's very difficult, but you have to include in your teaching and help the younger faculty to develop those things. So it's a very slow process, and it's a generational thing. Everything we are saying here is generational, I think, and you have to just keep doing it consistently. Yes.
And you're absolutely on target in the sense that you have program quality assurance agencies that where is DEI at the education level, at the chemistry level, at the architectural level, at the medical level. So it's not just at the university level, but it's every aspect. And that's what we mean about starting off with reflective practices. Somewhere, it has to begin somewhere. And then it has to grow. It has to be integrated fully at every level. And then it becomes, hopefully, the norm. And we may not need to have sessions like this.
It takes time, patience, and persistence.
Yes, and assessment of where are you in that practice, no matter where you are. Any other thoughts? Yes, here.
Thank you. Thanks for a very nice panel. I can introduce myself briefly first. I'm from Norway and I represent the Association of Norwegian Students Abroad, so all the students from Norway that go somewhere else to study, and I thought maybe it would be nice to also include the student perspective in this talk. And I think what you said about starting with reflection is very important, and I also wanted to just urge everyone in their work with this topic, which is extremely interesting and important, and it looks like there's really a lot happening on this topic right now, to make sure that students are included on all levels of decision making in these processes, both in informal ways, but also in the formal meeting rooms, and really give them a voice. Because I do think that the students that are underrepresented and that aren't achieving their full academic potential probably have a lot to say about why that is, and I think that's a really good starting point for those conversations. Thank you.
Not about us, without us. That's a slogan I heard very recently.
And going back, our students today are demanding that we pay attention to this. The students now are coming from environments internationally and within the United States with a different mindset about their voices that need to be heard. And as DEI academicians or part of the quality assurance, we have to hear them. Because students are, and a lot of people don't like, they are consumers. They will walk away if they do not feel that they are being adequately heard, engaged in, and being part of the decision-making processes. So thank you so very much. Are there any other concluding thoughts?
I think that we should continue.
Yes.
I mean, we should not stop at doing a survey and that's all. We should continue making more action to reach an implementation of DI in most of the universities and quality assurance agencies.
I'm going to do a shameless plug for CHEA, CIQG. It's on your website. And we encourage you to become members of CIQG if you're not, so that you too can be a part of the dissemination of data from across the globe and making a significant impact and influence the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you so very much for being here.